On the evening of May 5th, 1981, four men drove through the streets of Brooklyn toward a social club on 13th Avenue. They had left from a place called the My Way Lounge, stopped at a diner to meet two older captains who were supposed to be neutral parties, and then climbed into a van driven by two Sicilian associates they did not know well. The van delivered them to the door of a club that belonged to another crime family entirely, a nondescript storefront that Salvatore Gravano and Frank DeCicco of the Gambino organization had lent to the Bonanno family for the night. Three of the four men who walked through that door were captains in one of the most powerful criminal organizations in New York City, men who commanded crews of soldiers and associates across Brooklyn and the Bronx, men who controlled gambling operations, loan sharking networks, and labor rackets that generated millions of dollars annually. They believed they were attending a meeting to negotiate a peace agreement with the faction that opposed them. They believed the meeting was dangerous but survivable. They had told their people beforehand that if shooting started, everyone should try to get out on his own. Inside the club, the men who had called the meeting were waiting. Joseph Massino sat at a table with several other captains, men whose faces the arriving guests recognized and whose presence was meant to signal that this was a legitimate sit-down. What the three captains could not see was the closet door, slightly ajar, behind which four men in ski masks waited with shotguns, a submachine gun, and pistols. The meeting had been called for one purpose, and negotiation was not that purpose. Within minutes, all three captains were dead. The fourth man, a captain named Frank Lino, who had come as backup, escaped through an unlocked door he had noticed when he arrived. A piece of awareness that the difference between a man who survives and a man who does not sometimes reduces to something as small as knowing where the exits are. The man who organized the killings walked out of that club and into 2 decades of uncontested power. His name was Joseph Massino, and what happened in that room on 13th Avenue was the act that made him boss of the Bonanno crime family, the act that ended a civil war that had been tearing the organization apart for years, and the act that would, 23 years later, bring everything he had built crashing down around him in a federal courtroom in Brooklyn. Drop where you are watching from in the comments below. It is one of the best parts of doing this, and the geography never stops surprising us. If you are new here and want more history like this, subscribe now. Back to Brooklyn and the three men who walked into that meeting, believing they still had a chance. To understand why three captains died on 13th Avenue, you have to understand what the Bonanno family was and what it had become by the spring of 1981. No other New York crime family had experienced the particular combination of internal warfare, institutional humiliation, and leadership chaos that defined the Bonannos across the 2 decades preceding the killings. By the time those three men walked through that door, the family had been fighting with itself, in one form or another, for nearly 20 years. The dysfunction was not incidental to the story. It was the soil in which the killing was rooted. The organization that bore his name was founded in the aftermath of the Castellamarese War of 1930 and 1931, the conflict that reorganized the American Mafia into the structure that would govern it for the rest of the century. When Salvatore Maranzano was murdered in September of 1931 on orders from Charles Luciano, the family he had controlled passed to a young man from the same Sicilian town, Castellammare del Golfo, who had been at Maranzano's side throughout the war. Joseph Bonanno was 26 years old when he became boss. He would hold the position for more than 3 decades, building what became one of the most insular and disciplined of the 5 families that controlled organized crime in New York City. Membership was restricted largely to men whose families came from the same region of western Sicily. The family was small by design, rarely exceeding 200 made members, and its internal discipline was maintained through cultural bonds that the larger, more heterogeneous families could not replicate. Where the Gambinos and the Genoveses drew from a broader pool and managed their organizations through complex hierarchies of delegation, the Bonannos operated more like an extended clan, bound by regional loyalty and a shared understanding that outsiders were not to be trusted with the organization's internal affairs. For more than 3 decades, Bonanno ran the organization with a steady hand. The family expanded into gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and narcotics, maintaining a close alliance with the Profaci family that gave both organizations strength against their larger competitors. But by the early 1960s, Bonanno's ambitions had grown beyond what the other bosses on the commission, the governing body that regulated disputes among the families, were willing to tolerate. In 1963, he was accused of plotting to assassinate the bosses of the Gambino and Lucchese families and install himself as the dominant force in the New York underworld. The commission moved against him. In October of 1964, Bonanno was kidnapped off a Manhattan street in front of his own lawyer by men acting on orders from his cousin, Buffalo boss Stefano Magaddino, who had grown to despise him over decades of accumulated grievances and territorial disputes. He disappeared for nearly 2 years. When he resurfaced, the commission had already installed a new boss, Gaspar di Gregorio, and the family had fractured into warring factions. The internal conflict that followed, which the newspapers called the Banana War, after Bonanno's despised nickname, produced years of street-level violence that killed members and associates in restaurants, parking lots, and on street corners, and destroyed the family's standing within the national organization. By 1968, Bonanno had been forced into permanent retirement in Tucson, Arizona. The commission stripped the family of its seat, an act of institutional punishment without precedent among the five families. The most disciplined organization in the New York Mafia had become, in the span of a few years, its most chaotic. The damage was structural and would take decades to repair. The man who inherited the wreckage was Philip Rastelli, a captain from Maspeth, Queens, who was elevated to boss in 1973 after the death of interim boss Natale Evola. Rastelli was tall, physically fit, a man who reportedly did 1,500 sit-ups a day, even inside prison walls. He listed his occupation as a radio dispatcher for a taxi company. He was also, by the measures that mattered within the organization, profoundly unlucky in his timing. In 1976, he was convicted of extortion and sentenced to 10 years. He would spend all but approximately 3 years of his 18-year reign as boss locked inside federal institutions, attempting to run a criminal enterprise through intermediaries who did not always share his vision of how it should be run, and who increasingly questioned whether a man behind bars had any right to dictate what happened on the streets. During his entire tenure, the family was governed not by its boss, but by the men who spoke for him, and the question of who legitimately spoke for Rastelli became the central dispute that tore the organization apart. The power vacuum that Rastelli's imprisonment created was filled, violently, by a man named Carmine Galante. Born February 21, 1910, Galante had spent 12 years in federal prison on narcotics charges before his release in 1974. He was known as Lilo and as the Cigar, the latter for the omnipresent stogie that never left his mouth. He was feared within the organization in a way that went beyond ordinary respect. He was brutal, ambitious, and contemptuous of anyone who attempted to restrain him. Psychiatric evaluations from his youth had assessed his mental age at 14 and his intelligence quotient at 90, but whatever his formal test scores, his capacity for strategic violence was considerable. With Rastelli locked up and unable to exercise daily control, Galante seized effective command of the family. He expanded the heroin trade through a network of Sicilian immigrants he had imported to serve as soldiers and enforcers, men the American members of the family called Zips because of the speed at which they spoke their native dialect. He kept the profits from the drug operation largely for himself and did not share revenue with the other families. He did not defer to the commission. He made it known that he intended to become the most powerful boss in New York, a declaration that guaranteed his destruction. By 1979, the other bosses had decided Galante had to go. Paul Castellano of the Gambinos, Carmine Persico of the Colombos, and the leadership of the Genovese and Lucchese families all agreed that Galante's greed and recklessness posed a threat to every organization in New York. Even Joseph Bonanno himself, retired in the Arizona desert, was reported to have given his consent to the killing. The commission authorized the assassination. On July 12, 1979, Galante was sitting on the back patio of Joe and Mary's Italian-American restaurant on Knickerbocker Avenue in the Bushwick section of Brooklyn, finishing lunch with his cousin Giuseppe Turano and a Bonanno captain named Leonard Coppola. His two Sicilian bodyguards, Baldassare Amato and Cesare Bonventre, sat nearby. At approximately 2:45 in the afternoon, three masked gunmen walked through the restaurant and onto the patio. Galante took a shotgun blast to the upper chest and bullets through his left eye. Turano and Coppola were killed beside him. Amato and Bonventre, the bodyguards who had been entrusted with protecting Galante's life, walked away unharmed. Their survival was not coincidental. The photograph of Galante lying dead on the patio with his cigar still clenched between his teeth was published on the front page of the New York Post and became one of the most reproduced crime scene images in American history. Among the gunmen believed to have participated in the Galante assassination was a 28-year-old Bonanno soldier named Anthony Indelicato, known as Bruno. His father was Alphonse Indelicato, known as Sonny Red, a captain whose family traced its roots to Agrigento in Sicily, and whose nickname derived from his fondness for custom-made red leather cowboy boots and his hot-tempered, aggressive approach to family business. Bruno Indelicato's participation in the Galante hit earned him a promotion and elevated his father's standing within the reorganized family. Dominick Napolitano and Dominick Trinchera had also entered the restaurant that day carrying weapons. With Galante eliminated, Rastelli's position as official boss was reaffirmed, even though he remained in prison. What should have followed was a period of consolidation and stability. Rastelli was the recognized boss. The man who had challenged him was dead on a Brooklyn patio. The commission had sanctioned the killing and expected the family to fall into line behind its designated leader. Instead, the opposite happened. The Galante assassination did not end the Bonanno family's internal divisions. It rearranged them into a new and ultimately more lethal configuration. Three captains emerged from the post-Galante reorganization as leaders of a faction that grew increasingly hostile to Rastelli's continued leadership from prison. Alphonse Sonny Red Indelicato, born February 25, 1931, controlled a crew based in Brooklyn and Manhattan and had allied himself with powerful figures in the family hierarchy since the Banana War era. He was the ex-son-in-law of Bonanno Captain Charles Ruvolo, and his connections within the family ran deep. Philip Giaccone, born July 12, 1932, in Ridgewood, Queens, was known as Philly Lucky and also by the nickname The Priest, though the origin of the latter is not established in the surviving record. Giaccone had briefly served as Joseph Massino's own skipper for approximately 6 months in 1978, a fact that gave the coming violence a particular intimacy. Dominick Trinchera, born December 20th, 1936, was known as Big Trin for his physical size and commanded a crew with significant interests in gambling and labor racketeering across Brooklyn and the Bronx. The three captains shared a common grievance that went beyond personal ambition. Rastelli was in prison and would remain in prison for the foreseeable future. His authority over the family's daily operations was exercised through proxies, principally Joseph Massino and Dominick Napolitano, known as Sonny Black, two captains who had remained loyal to Rastelli throughout the Galante period, and who had emerged from the assassination as the family's most powerful street-level figures. The dissident captains viewed Rastelli's absentee leadership as fundamentally illegitimate. They viewed his proxies as men who had accumulated too much power without earning it through the traditional organizational path of demonstrated loyalty over decades. They began with holding tribute payments that were owed to the boss through his intermediaries. They expanded their own operations without seeking approval from Massino or Napolitano. They refused to accept directives that came through the proxy chain of command. They made their dissatisfaction known in meetings and in conversations that reached the ears of every significant figure in the family. The man who would decide whether these complaints ended in compromise or in death was Joseph Massino. Born on January 10, 1943, in Maspeth, Queens, Massino grew up in a working-class neighborhood where the boundary between legitimate employment and organized crime was crossed as easily as a street. His father worked in a factory. His mother kept the household together. The neighborhood was home to Italian and Eastern European immigrant families who lived in close quarters and who understood, without being told, that certain men on the block operated according to a different set of rules than the ones that governed the corner grocery or the local parish. Massino absorbed this understanding early. He dropped out of high school after his sophomore year, a decision that was less a failure of ambition than a redirection of it. His formal education was over. His other education was just beginning. His criminal career started with truck hijacking, a specialty that required physical courage, organizational skill, and the ability to move stolen goods quickly through a network of fences and buyers who could absorb large quantities of merchandise without attracting attention. He pursued this work alongside his brother-in-law, Salvatore Vitale, and an associate named Dwayne Leisenheimer, a carjacker whose skills complemented Massino's growing operation. The hijacking crew was profitable and efficient. Massino fenced stolen goods and ran numbers using a lunch wagon as a front, a mobile operation that placed him in contact with customers and associates across a wide territory. As his reputation grew, he opened a catering company called J&S Catering, which served as another front for his expanding criminal enterprises, and which would later figure in the financial forensics that helped dismantle his organization. In the course of his hijacking career, Massino befriended another young criminal from the same neighborhood who was building his own reputation in the Gambino family. The man's name was John Gotti. Both men were roughly the same age, both were working the same streets, and both were demonstrating the particular combination of physical aggression and organizational thinking that marked them for advancement within their respective families. The friendship between Massino and Gotti would prove operationally useful in ways neither man could have anticipated at the time. When Massino needed bodies buried in 1981, it was Gotti who provided the burial ground. Massino's mentor within the Bonanno organization was Rastelli himself. Massino called him Onk, an expression of the personal bond between a protege and the older man who had recognized his potential and placed him on the fast track to becoming a made member. Around 1973, when Rastelli was assuming command of the family, Massino became a formal associate under Rastelli's direct sponsorship. By the late 1960s, he had already been operating within the Bonanno orbit. By the mid-70s, he had been formally inducted as a made man. The ceremony that made him a member of La Cosa Nostra, the ritual of the pricked finger and the burning saint card, and the oath that bound a man to the organization until death, was the foundation upon which every subsequent decision of his life would be constructed. Rastelli's patronage was the foundation of everything Massino would build, and the relationship, whatever personal warmth it may have contained, was fundamentally structural. Rastelli's authority was the source of Massino's authority. If Rastelli fell, Massino's position within the organization fell with him. Defending Rastelli's throne was not merely an act of friendship or gratitude. It was an act of self-preservation conducted at the organizational level, a recognition that in the world Massino inhabited, the man who kept his patron in power kept himself in power, and the man who allowed his patron to be overthrown would find himself at the mercy of whoever came next. The tension between the two factions escalated steadily through 1980 and into early 1981. The Commission, which normally arbitrated internal disputes of this kind, initially attempted to maintain neutrality. The Bonanno family had already caused the Commission more trouble than any other organization in New York, and the other bosses had limited patience for another round of internal warfare from a family that had already been stripped of its seat for precisely this kind of self-destructive behavior. The message from the Commission was that there should be no bloodshed, at least not until Rastelli was released from prison and could assert his authority in person. The message bought time, but it did not resolve the underlying conflict. Both sides continued to prepare for the confrontation they knew was coming. The neutrality collapsed when Massino received intelligence from an informant, later identified as Carmine Francese, a cousin of the imprisoned Colombo family figure Sonny Francese, that the three dissident captains were stockpiling automatic weapons and planning to kill the Rastelli loyalists to seize complete control of the family. The information was specific and credible. Massino took it to the two most powerful bosses in New York. He went to Paul Castellano of the Gambinos and Carmine Persico of the Colombos and laid out what he knew. Their response was unambiguous. They told him to protect himself. In the language of the commission, this was authorization. The three captains had been sentenced by the only court whose judgments they had ever recognized. The authorization from Castellano and Persico was not merely a formality or a political courtesy. It was a structural requirement embedded in the rules that governed the relationship between the commission and the individual families. Under those rules, a captain could not order the killing of another captain without approval from his own boss and, in cases involving potential consequences for the wider organization, from the commission itself. The principle existed because unsanctioned killings between factions of the same family created the kind of instability that threatened every family in New York. A war inside the Bonannos could spill into the streets and draw law enforcement attention that affected the Gambinos, the Genoveses, and everyone else who operated in the same city under the same general understanding. The rules were designed to prevent exactly the kind of chaos that the Bonanno family had inflicted on itself and on the wider organization repeatedly over the previous 2 decades. The importance of the authorization would be demonstrated with devastating clarity 4 years later. In December of 1985, John Gotti, the same man who would help bury the three captains' bodies, orchestrated the murder of Gambino boss Paul Castellano outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan without obtaining commission approval. That unsanctioned killing set off a chain of retaliatory violence and institutional consequences that ultimately contributed to the destruction of the Gambino family's leadership and to Gotti's own conviction and imprisonment. Massino, who would later testify about the commission's response to the Castellano assassination, understood from the beginning that the rules existed for a reason and that following them was itself a form of protection. He had Rastelli's blessing from prison. He now had the sanction of the two most powerful bosses on the street. He had followed the rules. The three men who had challenged those rules, who had stockpiled weapons and planned to impose their will through violence that no one had authorized, would pay the price for the challenge. The system they had attempted to overthrow would now execute them through its own procedures. The plan was constructed with the operational precision that would become Massino's organizational signature for the next 2 decades. Every element was chosen for a specific reason. Every participant was assigned a specific role. Every contingency that could be anticipated was addressed before the evening began. Gerlando Sciascia, a Sicilian-born captain known as George from Canada who served as the liaison between the Bonanno family in New York and the Rizzuto crime family in Montreal, was designated as the man who would arrange the meeting. Sciascia was born in Cattolica Eraclea, Sicily, in 1934. He had immigrated first to Montreal and then established himself as a cross-border operative, connecting the Canadian and American wings of the organization. He was perceived by the dissident captains as a neutral figure, someone whose Sicilian origins and Canadian base placed him outside the immediate factional politics of the New York street. His role was to lure the three captains to the meeting under the pretext of a final peace negotiation, a last attempt to resolve the family's conflict before it escalated into the kind of open warfare that had destroyed the family once before. The location was chosen with equal deliberation. The club on 13th Avenue belonged to the Gambino family, specifically to the crew controlled by Gravano and DeZico. Using a Gambino-controlled location served multiple purposes. It removed the meeting from Bonanno territory, where the dissidents might have positioned their own people in the surrounding streets. It placed the killing on ground controlled by allies who had a direct interest in Massino's success, since Castellano himself had authorized the action, and it ensured that if anything went wrong, the immediate surroundings would be managed by men who were part of the plan, rather than witnesses who might become complications. Inside the club, Massino positioned 4 gunmen in a closet in the storeroom where the meeting was to take place. Salvatore Vitale, Massino's brother-in-law and his closest confidant in the organization, held a submachine gun. Vito Rizzuto, the rising power in the Montreal organization who had traveled to New York specifically for this assignment, held a pistol. Emanuele Ragusa, another Montreal associate, was armed as well. A fourth man, known in later testimony only as the Old Timer and identified by Massino years later as a man named Bonventre, carried a double-barreled shotgun. All four wore ski masks to prevent identification in the event that anyone other than the intended targets survived the encounter. The closet door was left slightly ajar so the gunmen could monitor the room and emerge on signal. In the main room, Massino waited with several other captains whose presence was designed to make the meeting appear routine and legitimate. Joseph Ziccarelli, known as Joe Bayonne, and Nicola Di Stefano, known as Nick the Battler, were veteran captains who had been invited specifically to reassure the arriving dissidents that this was a genuine sit-down, not an ambush. Santo Giordano, called Tony, and Sciascia himself completed the welcoming party. Giovanni Ligamari was also present. The old-timers, Ziccarelli and Di Stefano, may or may not have known what was about to happen. Their ignorance, whether genuine or performed, was itself part of the architecture of the evening. Earlier that evening, before they left for the meeting, Sonny Red Indelicato gathered his people and made his preparations. He called in Frank Lino, who was serving as acting captain for Bruno Indelicato's crew, and explained the situation. He told Lino that he, Trinchera, and Giaccone were going to a dangerous meeting with the Rastelli faction and that the outcome was uncertain. The three captains knew there was a real possibility they might be killed. They had been weighing this possibility for weeks, and they had decided to go anyway, because refusing to attend would have been interpreted as an act of war that would trigger the same violence they were hoping to prevent. Indelicato instructed his son Bruno, who was not attending the meeting, and the men who remained behind to retaliate against Massino's faction if things went wrong. Before he walked out the door, Indelicato spoke the words that Lino would repeat in a federal courtroom 23 years later. "If there is shooting," he said, "everybody's on their own. Try to get out." The four men stopped first at the My Way Lounge, Lino's club, then drove in separate cars to a diner where they met Ziccarelli and Di Stefano, the two supposedly neutral captains. Two Zips arrived at the diner in a van to transport the entire group to the meeting location. The dissidents left their own vehicles at a nearby Nathan's famous restaurant and climbed into the van, a decision that placed them entirely in the hands of the men who controlled the transportation and who knew exactly where the van was going and why. They arrived at the club unarmed. The terms of the sit-down, as communicated through Sciascia, had specified that no one would carry weapons. Sciascia led the arriving men through the club toward the back room. What happened next was reconstructed years later through the testimony of multiple cooperating witnesses, principally Lino, Vitale, and eventually Massino himself, who took the stand in 2011. The accounts do not agree on every detail. The sequence of shots, the exact positioning of each man, the precise words spoken differ in the retelling, but the essential facts converge into a coherent narrative, and the narrative is this. As the three captains and Frank Lino entered the storeroom, the closet door swung open. The four men in ski masks stepped out. According to Vitale's testimony, the announcement came immediately. "Nobody move. This is a stick-up." The phrase was a prearranged signal. It was designed to freeze the arriving men for the fraction of a second the gunmen needed to raise their weapons and open fire. The phrasing also served a secondary purpose. If anyone outside the room heard the commotion and the words, they would think the club was being robbed, not that a planned execution was underway. In the same instant, Sciascia ran his fingers through his hair, a separate signal to the men in the main room that the action had begun. The room erupted. Shotgun blasts and pistol fire tore through the confined space of the storeroom. Giaccone attempted to run and was shot and went down. Trinchera, whose physical size made him an enormous and conspicuous target, absorbed a tremendous volume of gunfire but would not fall. Massino's own testimony, delivered 2 decades later with the clinical detachment of a man recounting an operational decision, indicated that Trinchera took shot after shot and remained standing until a blast from the double-barreled shotgun finally brought him to the floor. Indelicato was hit in the side and in the back. Still moving, bleeding, he started for the door. According to Vitale's account, Sciascia reached behind his back, pulled a concealed pistol, and shot Indelicato on the left side of the head. By that time, Vitale said, it was all over. Massino himself grabbed Indelicato's leg as the dying man tried to reach the exit, ensuring he would not leave the room alive. Frank Lino survived because of a detail he had noticed when they first arrived. There was an unlocked door in the room that led to a hallway and out of the building. When the shooting started, Lino ran for that door. Massino grabbed for him, caught at his leg, but Lino broke free and got through. He escaped into the Brooklyn night. His familiarity with the club, which he had frequented for drinking and gambling, gave him knowledge of the layout that the three captains did not possess. Indelicato also tried to reach the same door, but between the gunfire and Massino's grip, he did not make it. Behind Lino, in the storeroom, the three captains he had accompanied to the meeting were dead, on the floor of a club that did not even belong to their own family. The aftermath was managed with the same operational discipline that had characterized every phase of the plan. The bodies had to disappear completely and permanently. If any of the three were found quickly, forensic evidence could connect the killings to the men who had carried them out and to the location where the murders had taken place. Massino understood that the killing itself was only half the problem. The disposal was the other half, and in many cases the half that produced the evidence that sent men to prison. Massino contacted his friend John Gotti, who arranged for Gambino Associates to handle the disposal as a personal favor. The favor was significant. Disposing of three bodies simultaneously required manpower, vehicles, a location, and the absolute certainty that the men involved would never speak about what they had done. Gotti provided all of this without hesitation. The three corpses were wrapped in painter's dropcloths, loaded into a van, and driven through the nighttime streets of Brooklyn and Queens, toward a vacant lot in the Lindenwood section of Queens, near the border with Brooklyn, in an area the locals called the Hole. The lot sat near an auto salvage yard at the corner of Ruby Street and Flatlands Avenue, not far from John F. Kennedy International Airport, in a waterlogged stretch of low ground that flooded regularly and that had been used by multiple organized crime families over the years as an informal burial site. According to Vitale's later testimony, he and Massino followed the van in a separate car and observed the operation. Gotti's men dug the graves and placed the three captains into the earth of a lot that was already, by the informal understanding of the men who used it, a gangland cemetery. The concealment did not hold completely, and the failure came sooner than anyone involved had anticipated. On May 28, 1981, 23 days after the murders, Indelicato's body was discovered in the lot. The story reported at the time and repeated in numerous accounts over the years was that children playing in the area had noticed an odd smell emanating from a section of disturbed earth, and that a boy kicking the loosened soil had discovered a human hand protruding from the ground. The boy told his parents. The parents called the police. New York police officer Andrew Kilienti responded to the call and found a body wrapped in a bedsheet. This account was vivid, specific, and false. It was later revealed to have been a fabrication, a cover story carefully constructed by law enforcement to protect an earlier informant who had provided the actual tip about the burial location. The informant's identity was too valuable to compromise, and so the story of the playing children was invented to explain how the body came to be found without revealing the real source. The fabrication persisted in published accounts for decades. Investigators recovered Indelicato's remains and identified them through fingerprints. His son-in-law, Salvatore Valenti, confirmed the identification 4 days later. The discovery was an operational failure for Massino, the kind of loose end that a man who prized control over every detail could not tolerate and could not undo. It established that Indelicato was dead. It established approximately where he had been buried, and it created a permanent piece of evidence that would eventually contribute to the foundation of the case that brought Massino down. The bodies of Giaccone and Trinchera, however, remained undiscovered. They lay in the same lot, just yards from where Indelicato had been found, beneath layers of concrete and heavy soil that had been poured over them to ensure they would not surface the way their companion had. They would stay buried for 23 years, their families unable to give them a proper burial, their fates known to the men who had killed them, but unconfirmed by any authority until the ground was finally opened again in 2004. The killings accomplished exactly what Massino had designed them to accomplish. The dissident faction was decapitated in a single evening. The crews that had been loyal to the three captains were given a choice between alignment with the winning side and annihilation. Most chose alignment. Several key figures who had supported the dissidents, including former consigliere Nicholas Marangello and Captain Michael Sabella, switched their allegiance to Rastelli's faction before the week was out. Bruno Indelicato, whose father's blood was still being cleaned from the floor of the 13th Avenue Club, became a marked man. Napolitano assigned the contract to kill Bruno to his most trusted associate, a man named Donnie Brasco. The contract would never be fulfilled, but not for the reason Napolitano expected. The immediate aftermath produced one more killing that was directly connected to the events of May 5th. Dominick Sonny Black Napolitano had been one of Massino's closest allies throughout the planning and execution of the three captains' murders. Born June 16, 1930, in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, the grandson of immigrants from Naples, Napolitano had earned his nickname by dyeing his silver hair black. He was a fierce, respected captain who ran his crew from the Motion Lounge in Greenpoint. He had played a critical role in the Rastelli faction's victory. He had personally participated in the Galante assassination 2 years earlier. He was, by every organizational measure, a man who had proven his value. But Napolitano carried a liability that the elimination of the three captains could not neutralize. For the previous 5 years, Napolitano had been the primary handler of the man he knew as Donnie Brasco, a jewel thief and aspiring wise guy who had gradually worked his way from the fringes of the Colombo family into the inner circle of Napolitano's Bonanno crew. Brasco had attended meetings where criminal operations were discussed in specific detail. He had participated in hijacking and fencing operations. He had earned enough trust that Napolitano was preparing to sponsor him for induction as a made member of the Bonanno family, one of the most closely guarded honors in the organization. The fact that an outsider was on the verge of being inducted into the family through Napolitano's sponsorship was itself a reflection of how completely Brasco had embedded himself in the organization's daily life. Donnie Brasco was not a jewel thief. His real name was Joseph Pistone. He was born September 17th, 1939, and he was a special agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation who had been assigned to conduct what became one of the most extraordinary undercover operations in American law enforcement history. From 1976 through 1981, Pistone lived inside the Bonanno crime family under his assumed identity, penetrating the organization to a depth that no federal agent had ever achieved with any organized crime family in the history of the American Mafia. The operation had originally been conceived as a short-term infiltration focused on fencing operations. It expanded year by year as Pistone embedded himself deeper into the daily life of the organization. He had started at the fringes, working his way in through a Colombo family-connected bar in Manhattan before drifting toward the Bonanno crew run by Benjamin Ruggiero, known as Lefty Guns, who became his primary connection and his unwitting guide to the organization's internal world. Through Ruggiero, Pistone met Napolitano. Through Napolitano, he gained access to the family's operational discussions, its internal politics, and its criminal planning. He attended meetings where hijacking operations were organized, where the distribution of stolen goods was negotiated, and where violence was discussed with the casual specificity of men who treated murder as a business function. He was so thoroughly accepted that Napolitano was preparing to sponsor him for induction as a made member. the ceremony that would have required Pistone to swear an oath of loyalty to an organization he was systematically dismantling. The operation lasted 6 years. J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI's longtime director who had died in 1972, had never wanted agents to work undercover, fearing they would be corrupted by extended exposure to the criminal world. Pistone's work helped convince the Bureau that deep undercover operations were not merely possible but essential. When the assignment to kill Bruno Indelicato was issued, the FBI recognized that the operation had reached its absolute limit. An agent could not commit murder regardless of what it would cost the investigation. Pistone was pulled from the field, debriefed, and placed under protection. The intelligence he had gathered would eventually produce more than 120 convictions. Shortly after the operation ended, FBI agents visited the Motion Lounge in Greenpoint and informed Napolitano that the man he had trusted for 6 years, the man he had planned to induct into his organization, the man he had treated as a friend and a protege, was a federal agent. They also offered Napolitano the opportunity to save himself by becoming an informant. Napolitano refused the offer without hesitation. He understood what the revelation meant. Allowing an FBI agent to infiltrate his crew, to sit in rooms where criminal operations were discussed in operational detail, to attend social functions where the family's hierarchy was visible to anyone who was watching, to come within days of being inducted as a made man, was the most catastrophic security breach in the history of the American Mafia. There was no defense against this kind of failure. There was no argument, no favor owed, no past service rendered, no victory in a factional war that could offset the magnitude of the damage that had been done. The infiltration was not just a personal humiliation for Napolitano, it was an institutional humiliation for the entire family, and by extension, for the commission that governed it. Someone had to pay for it, and the identity of that someone was never in question. Before he was summoned to what he knew would be his final meeting, Napolitano returned to the Motion Lounge and made his preparations. He handed his jewelry to his favorite bartender, a man who had worked for him at the club for years. He gave the bartender the keys to his apartment and asked him to take care of his pigeons. Napolitano kept pigeons on the roof of his building, a hobby that was common among men in the Brooklyn neighborhoods where he had grown up, and that carried its own quiet symbolism for a man who was about to be caged and killed. He was not a man given to sentimentality or dramatic farewell, but a man who has run out of time arranges his affairs with whatever precision the remaining hours allow. The jewelry and the keys and the pigeons were the last things he could control. On August 17, 1981, less than 4 months after the 3 captains were killed, Napolitano was picked up and driven to a house belonging to Bonanno associate Ron Filacamo in Flatlands, Brooklyn. He was told a meeting was being held in the basement. As he was led toward the stairs, he was shoved down them. A gunman was waiting at the bottom. Napolitano was shot. The gun jammed before the shooter could finish. Sprawled on the basement floor, Napolitano reportedly asked them to finish the job. They did. His hands were severed and his face was destroyed, measures intended to prevent identification. His body was transported to Staten Island and dumped in a creek. His remains were recovered a year later, in August of 1982, and identified through dental records. Massino later explained his reasoning in a phrase that his brother-in-law Vitale repeated under oath. He said he had to give Napolitano a receipt for the Donnie Brasco situation. The Pistone infiltration produced consequences that extended far beyond Napolitano's death. The intelligence the undercover agent had gathered during his 6 years inside the family led to more than 120 convictions of Bonanno members and associates. The commission, already contemptuous of the Bonanno family's history of self-inflicted disasters, formally stripped the family of its seat for the second time, a humiliation no other New York family had suffered even once. Napolitano himself, in a detail that Pistone's later memoir would record, harbored no ill feelings toward the man who had deceived him. Shortly before his death, Napolitano told someone close to him that if anyone was going to be responsible for taking him down, he was glad it was Pistone, because Pistone was a good guy. The man who sentenced him to death for the infiltration and the man who conducted the infiltration were, in their own estimation, both professionals who had done their jobs. The distinction was that one of them survived the professionalism of the other. The destruction of the dissident faction and the execution of Napolitano cleared the organizational landscape for Massino to become, in all practical terms, the most powerful figure in the Bonanno family. Rastelli remained the official boss, but he was a figurehead whose authority existed primarily in the loyalty that Massino chose to demonstrate toward him. When Rastelli was paroled in April of 1983, he returned to nominal command but relied on Massino for the daily operational decisions that determined the family's direction. In October of 1986, Rastelli was convicted on 24 counts of labor racketeering. In January of 1987, he was sentenced to 12 years. Before the conviction, Rastelli formally designated Massino as underboss and granted him two extraordinary powers that acting bosses were almost never given. He authorized Massino to approve new members for induction, and he authorized Massino to order murders on his behalf. These were the powers of a boss in everything but name. The family had previously lost its commission seat during the Banana War, a punishment that had felt at the time like a crippling blow to the organization's prestige and influence. But the expulsion carried a paradoxical benefit that no one could have predicted when it was imposed. Because the Bonannos were not represented on the commission during the mid-1980s, they were not included as defendants in the landmark Mafia Commission trial of 1985 and 1986. The case prosecuted by Rudolph Giuliani's office in the Southern District of New York that charged the leadership of the five families with operating the commission as a criminal enterprise under RICO. The trial resulted in convictions and 100-year sentences for the bosses of the Genovese, Lucchese, and Colombo families, and for the acting boss and underboss of the Gambino family. The case devastated the upper ranks of 4 of the 5 families simultaneously, removing an entire generation of leadership in a single prosecution. The Bonannos, having already been punished by exclusion from the very body that was now being prosecuted, escaped the case entirely. Rastelli had initially been included in the indictment, but was removed by prosecutors and convicted separately on labor racketeering charges that carried a 12-year sentence. The irony was precise and unrepeatable. The family that had been expelled from the commission for its dysfunction was the family that survived the prosecution that destroyed the commission. Their leadership hierarchy, unlike those of the other 4 families, remained intact. The punishment had become a shield. Rastelli was released from federal prison on humanitarian grounds on June 4, 1991. Judge Charles Sifton, the same judge who had sentenced him, ordered the release because Rastelli was believed to be dying. He was. 20 days later, on June 24th, Philip Rastelli died of liver cancer at Booth Memorial Hospital in Queens. He was 73 years old. He had held the title of boss for 18 years. He had been a free man during that time for approximately 3 of those years. He had presided from behind bars over the most turbulent period in the family's history, and the men who had fought and killed to keep him in power had done so not because he was a great leader, but because the alternative was the kind of leaderless chaos that had already consumed the organization once. Massino succeeded him as the official boss of the Bonanno crime family, a position he had held in all but name since at least 1986. The organization he inherited bore the accumulated scars of a quarter-century of continuous upheaval, and Massino understood that inheriting a damaged institution was only useful if you could rebuild it into something stronger than what it had been before it broke. He set about the reconstruction with a set of security protocols that reflected every lesson he had absorbed from watching others fail, every mistake he had witnessed, every conviction he had studied, every cooperating witness who had brought down a rival family, fed into a philosophy of operational concealment that he now imposed on the entire Bonanno organization with absolute authority. He closed the family's social clubs, the traditional gathering places where members had congregated for decades, and where law enforcement had conducted its most productive surveillance. The clubs were where agents took photographs, where listening devices were planted, where patterns of association were documented. Massino understood that the clubs were not merely gathering places. They were intelligence collection points for the other side. He shut them down. Members were forbidden from congregating in fixed locations that could be monitored. He forbade his captains and soldiers from speaking his name in any conversation, anywhere, under any circumstances. The prohibition was absolute. When they needed to refer to him, they touched their chins or formed the letter C with their fingers, the same system that Vincent Gigante of the Genovese family had imposed on his own organization, a system Massino admired and adopted. He required that family meetings be held at remote locations, at restaurants in other boroughs, at outdoor venues, at private gatherings that could be presented to any observer as vacations or social events. He insisted that conversations of operational significance be conducted in motion, in cars, on walks, in locations where the duration of the conversation was controlled by the participants and where the planting of listening devices was impossible. He compartmentalized information between crews so that no single member, no matter how senior, possessed knowledge of the full scope of the family's operations. He understood that the government built its cases through the testimony of cooperating witnesses, and that a cooperating witness could only damage what he knew about. A man who knew the operations of his own crew, but nothing about the operations of other crews, was a limited threat, even if he turned. The architecture of ignorance was a form of organizational protection, and Massino imposed it with a rigor that his predecessors had never attempted. The approach produced results. Throughout the 1990s, while the bosses of every other New York family were arrested, tried, convicted, and imprisoned, Massino remained free and uncharged. John Gotti of the Gambinos, the man who had helped bury the three captains' bodies, was convicted in 1992 and died in prison in 2002. Vincent Gigante of the Genoveses was convicted in 1997. Vittorio Amuzzo of the Lucchese's was serving a life sentence. Carmine Persico of the Colombos, the same boss who had authorized the three captains' killings, was serving 100 years. Massino alone among the five families' bosses walked free. The press gave him a title that he had earned through absence and discipline. They called him the Last Don, and the name stuck because it was accurate. He was the only full-fledged boss of a New York family who was not behind bars. Under his leadership, the Bonannos regained their seat on the commission, reversing a humiliation that had persisted since the Pistone disaster. His friendship with John Gotti helped facilitate the restoration, and the other families acknowledged that Massino had rebuilt an organization that most had written off as permanently broken. By the turn of the new millennium, federal authorities assessed Massino as the most powerful mafia leader in the country. The family that had been the most damaged organization in New York had been restored to something that exceeded its former power. The restoration was built on the foundation laid in that storeroom on 13th Avenue, and like all foundations composed of violence and secrets, it contained the mechanisms of its own collapse. The men who had witnessed and participated in the three captains' murders were still alive. The forensic evidence was still in the ground, and the law of cooperating witnesses, the force that had dismantled every major organized crime enterprise of the 20th century, was patient. In 2002, the wall that Massino had built around his organization developed its first cracks. Two Bonanno captains became government cooperators, entering the witness protection program and breaking the family's historic claim, the one distinction that had separated the Bonannos from every other New York family, that no Bonanno-made man had ever turned informant. The pride that Massino had taken in this record, the fact that the Bonannos had produced Donnie Brasco, but had never produced a rat, was erased by the defections. The two cooperators triggered a cascade. FBI agents who had been pursuing the Bonanno family for years suddenly had access to men who could provide the kind of inside testimony that no amount of surveillance or forensic work could replicate. A parallel investigation by FBI forensic accountants, specialists who spent 2 years tracing the family's financial operations through documented records, added a second dimension to the case. The combination of cooperating witnesses and financial forensics created a prosecution that was virtually impossible to defend against. On January 9, 2003, Massino was arrested in a sweeping RICO indictment that charged him with, among other crimes, the murder of Dominick Napolitano and a pattern of racketeering that spanned decades. Salvatore Vitale was also indicted. The relationship between the two men, the bond between brothers-in-law that had sustained a criminal partnership through hijacking, through murder, through the closet on 13th Avenue, and the years of power that followed, had deteriorated after Vitale's own arrest in 2001. When Massino failed to contact Vitale's wife and children afterward, failed to send anyone to ask if they needed money or help, the omission registered as what it was. In the world they inhabited, not calling the family of an arrested man was an act of abandonment, a signal that the man in custody had been written off. Vitale's sister Josephine, who was married to Massino, sat in the courtroom and refused to stand when her brother entered to testify. She scoffed under her breath as he spoke. The family that the organization had created had consumed the family that biology had created. Frank Lino, who had been arrested in 2003 and spent 81 days in solitary confinement for his own protection before formally agreeing to cooperate, provided the first full eyewitness account of the three captains' murders. He described the arrival at the club, the men waiting in the main room, the closet with the door ajar, the signal, the shooting, and his escape through the unlocked door. His testimony was the first time anyone who had been in that room had told a jury exactly what had happened. Vitale corroborated the account and expanded it across 2 decades of shared criminal activity with Massino. In total, 8 cooperating witnesses took the stand against the man they had once served. The 2-month trial was described by observers as the most formidable organized crime prosecution since the 1997 case against Genovese boss Vincent Gigante. On July 30th, 2004, the jury convicted Joseph Massino on every count. The verdict included the murders of the 3 captains, the murder of Napolitano, and the full pattern of racketeering that had defined his criminal career. His daughter Adeline sat in the courtroom and whispered 2 words when the verdict was read. His wife, Vitale's sister, had been present throughout the trial, watching as the brother she had grown up with dismantled the husband she had married. Massino stood impassively as the verdicts were read. When lawyers discussed the forfeiture hearing that would strip him of his assets, he turned to his wife and offered a brief shrug. He now faced life in prison. He also faced a superseding indictment for an 8th murder, one that carried the possibility of the federal death penalty. The victim was Gerlando Ciascia, the same George from Canada who had arranged the meeting on 13th Avenue, who had run his fingers through his hair to signal the start of the killing, who had pulled a pistol and shot Sonny Red Indelicato in the head as he tried to escape. Massino had ordered Ciascia killed in 1999 after a series of disputes over authority, the independence of the Montreal Rizzuto organization, and Ciascia's complaints about a Massino loyalist who was using drugs. At a wedding anniversary party, Massino had delivered the order to Vitale in 6 words: "George has got to go." On March 18, 1999, Ciascia was shot in the head with a silenced pistol in an SUV, and his body was dumped on a deserted Bronx street. The man who had been essential to the events of May 5, 1981, was killed by the same organization he had served that night. Facing execution for the Ciascia murder and life imprisonment for everything else, Massino made a choice that no boss of a New York crime family had ever made before him. He agreed to cooperate with the federal government. He became an informant. He wore a recording device while imprisoned at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan and secretly taped conversations with Vincent Basciano, the acting boss he had appointed as his successor, who was known as Vinnie Gorgeous and who was himself facing murder charges. On the recordings, Basciano discussed the killing of Bonanno associate Randolph Pizzolo in explicit terms and spoke about a plot to assassinate a federal prosecutor. The recordings were devastating, the kind of evidence that left no room for the defense arguments that had sustained organized crime defendants for generations. In April of 2011, Massino took the witness stand in Basciano's trial in Brooklyn Federal Court and became the first boss of a New York crime family in history to testify against a former subordinate. He sat in the witness box and cataloged his crimes with the clinical detachment of a man who had spent decades thinking in operational terms. When a prosecutor asked him what powers he had held as boss of the Bonanno family, Massino answered in a single sentence that contained everything anyone needed to know about what the position meant. murders, responsibility for the family, made captains, break captains. The answer was complete. There was nothing else to add. Paciano was convicted. In July of 2013, a federal judge sentenced Massino to time, served, and released him after approximately 10.5 years in custody. The cooperation that had begun with the decision to wear a wire had been deemed so extraordinarily valuable, so productive in its yield of convictions and intelligence, that the man who had orchestrated the murder of 3 captains ordered the execution of his own ally, killed the man who had arranged the meeting where those captains died, and presided over a criminal enterprise that had generated hundreds of millions of dollars, was allowed to walk free. He surrendered hundreds of gold bars that had been hidden in his restaurant and $7 million in cash that had been concealed in his attic. He entered the federal witness protection program and disappeared into whatever anonymous life the government provides for men who know too much to be left unprotected. In October of 2004, a combined task force of FBI agents and NYPD cold case investigators returned to the hole, the vacant lot in Lindenwood where the 3 captains had been buried 23 years earlier. Working from information provided by Massino and other cooperators, they spent 3 weeks excavating through concrete and heavy mud, using backhoes to break ground and rakes and sifters to search the soil. They found what they were looking for. In December of 2004, the New York Medical Examiner's Office positively identified the skeletal remains of Philip Giaccone and Dominick Trinchera. Among the items recovered from the excavation was a Piaget watch that had belonged to Giaccone's wife. 2 men who had been missing for more than 2 decades were finally accounted for. Their families could bury them properly. The ground that had concealed the evidence of what happened on May 5th, 1981, had finally given it up. The chain of consequences that extended from that single evening in a Brooklyn social club destroyed every principal figure it touched, and it took its time doing so. The destruction was not immediate. It unfolded across decades, patient and methodical, as though the events of May 5th, 1981 had set in motion a mechanism that required 23 years to complete its full rotation. Massino became boss and rebuilt the family into the most secretive and powerful organization in New York, and then the same murders that had made him boss became the central evidence in the prosecution that convicted him. The act that created his empire was the act that dismantled it. Napolitano, who had helped plan the killings and who had participated in the violence that eliminated the dissident faction, was executed 3 months later for a failure that had nothing to do with the 3 captains and everything to do with a man named Pistone, who had sat in his crew for 6 years, with a federal badge hidden behind a jewel thief's alias. Sciascia, who arranged the meeting and fired the shot that ended Indelicato's life in the storeroom, was murdered on Massino's orders 18 years afterward, shot in the head in an SUV, and dumped on a Bronx street because the man who had once valued his services had come to view him as a challenge to his authority. Vitale stepped out of the closet with a submachine gun and 2 decades later stepped onto a witness stand in a Brooklyn federal courtroom to describe exactly what he had done with it, testifying against his own brother-in-law while his sister sat in the gallery and refused to look at him. Lino escaped through the unlocked door and eventually became the first Bonanno-made man in history to cooperate with the federal government, providing the eyewitness testimony that no prosecution can succeed without. Vito Rizzuto, who had traveled from Montreal to stand in that closet with a pistol, was extradited from Canada to the United States in 2006, pleaded guilty to racketeering charges in 2007 after admitting to the judge that his role had been to announce the stick-up so everyone would stand still, and served approximately 5 years before returning to Montreal, where he died of natural causes in December of 2013 at the age of 67. Bruno Indelicato, Sonny Red's son, the man whose father's blood was on the floor of the storeroom and who survived only because he was not present at the meeting, was convicted in 1987 for his role in the Galante assassination, served 19 years, was convicted again in 2008 for a separate Bonanno-related murder, served 14 more years, and upon his release was reportedly welcomed back into the family and appointed consigliere around 2023. His father's murder had not ended the Indelicato name within the organization. It had merely interrupted it for 40 years. The Bonanno family itself survived all of it. It survived the Bonanno War, the Galante period, the three captains' murders, the Donnie Brasco infiltration, the double loss of its commission seat, the indictment and conviction of its boss, and the unprecedented spectacle of that boss testifying against his own organization from a federal witness stand. By every historical precedent, the organization should have ceased to exist. The families that the government had targeted with less comprehensive prosecutions had been permanently weakened. The Gambino family, after Gotti's conviction, never recovered anything close to its former power. The Lucchese and Colombo families had been reduced to shadows of what they had been in their prime. The Bonannos, the family that had suffered more self-inflicted damage than any of its peers, endured. Federal assessments in the years following Massino's cooperation described the family as diminished in stature but still operational. Its hierarchy reorganized under new leadership, its rackets still generating revenue, its membership still bound by the same oaths and rituals that had governed it since Joseph Bonanno first took command at the age of 26. Three captains walked into a meeting on 13th Avenue in Brooklyn on a spring evening in 1981. They walked in unarmed, having been told the meeting was a negotiation. They walked in knowing the danger was real, having told their people to retaliate if things went wrong, having instructed the men who stayed behind that if there was shooting, everybody was on his own. They walked in because refusing to walk in would have been an admission that the war had already started, and they were not yet ready to fight it on those terms. They chose diplomacy because the alternative was a conflict they believed they could still avoid. The man who called the meeting had already made a different choice. 4 men waited in a closet with ski masks and loaded weapons. 1 man sat at a table and waited for his guests to arrive. The guests arrived. The closet opened. And the consequences of what happened in the next 60 seconds of shotgun blasts and pistol fire in a storeroom on a Brooklyn side street rippled outward for a quarter of a century, destroying not only the men who died that night, but eventually the man who killed them, the man who arranged the meeting, the man who stood in the closet, the man who buried the bodies, the man who escaped through the unlocked door, and the code of silence that every one of them had sworn to uphold until the day they died. The oath that bound them was supposed to be permanent. It was supposed to be the one thing that held when everything else collapsed. It did not hold. It was broken by the same man who had enforced it more ruthlessly than anyone in the family's history. The man who called the meeting walked out of it alive. He walked into a future that took 23 years to arrive, but when it arrived, it took everything he had built, every dollar he had hidden, every alliance he had forged, every secret he had kept, and the oath itself. The family he constructed kept running. The oath he swore did not survive him, and the 3 men who died on the floor of that storeroom, Alphonse Indelicato at 50, Philip Giaccone at 48, Dominick Trinchera at 44, remained where they had been placed, in a waterlogged lot near an airport in Queens, until the same government that eventually freed their killer finally dug them up and brought them home.